The metro was alive with its usual cacophony, squealing brakes, muffled conversations, and the occasional crackle of the overhead intercom. It was rush hour, and the train was crammed with commuters packed shoulder to shoulder. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive warmth that only comes from too many bodies confined in too small a space. But no one complained. They simply stood in silent resignation, counting the minutes until their stop. It was on one of these ordinary rides that Clara first noticed him. At first, she thought nothing of the tall man in the hooded jacket standing across the aisle. He was unremarkable at a glance, his face obscured by the brim of a weathered baseball cap. But something about him nagged at the corner of her awareness. He never swayed with the motion of the train, never adjusted his grip on the pole. He just stood there, unnaturally still, staring, not at her, but at the middle distance, as though fixated on something invisible. Clara shifted uneasily. She turned her gaze to her phone, trying to ignore the strange tension building in her chest. She was being paranoid, she told herself. It was just another eccentric stranger in the endless sea of them that flowed through the city. The train lurched to a stop and the doors hissed open. Passengers flooded out and a fresh wave filed in. Clara glanced up again, expecting the man to be gone, but he was still there, still unmoving, still staring. And this time, his head had turned ever so slightly, just enough that she could see the gleam of his eyes beneath the shadow of the cap. They were fixed on her. Her stomach twisted and she looked away, heart pounding. She told herself she was imagining things, that it was just coincidence. Yet, as the train hurtled toward its next stop, the sensation of being watched intensified. Clara dared another glance. His eyes were still on her, unblinking, hollow. They seemed to drink in the dim, flickering light of the carriage. The train stopped again, and Clara felt a rush of relief as she prepared to disembark. She shuffled through the crowd, practically pushing her way out the door and onto the platform. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The last thing she wanted was to see those eyes again. The platform was bustling with commuters. She told herself she was safe here. But as she ascended the stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. She fought the urge to turn around. Her pulse quickened, and each step felt heavier than the last. At the top of the stairs, she finally glanced back. There he was, at the bottom, standing still amid the flowing crowd, watching. Clara's breath hitched. She hurried into the open air, her every sense screaming at her to get away. The city's familiar noise surrounded her. Honking horns, chatter, the rhythmic clatter of footsteps, but it felt muted, distant. She kept her pace brisk, resisting the urge to run. It wasn't until she reached her apartment and slammed the door behind her that she allowed herself to exhale. Her hands trembled as she locked the deadbolt. She laughed nervously at herself. It was ridiculous. Just a random man on the metro. Probably harmless. She was overreacting. That night, she dreamt of him. He was standing at the foot of her bed, his face obscured but his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She tried to scream, to move, but her body was paralyzed. He raised a hand and pointed at her, his finger unnaturally long, his nail sharp as a talon. The dream dissolved into static, like a television screen caught between channels, and she woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The following day, Clara hesitated before boarding the metro. She considered walking to work, but it would take too long. Besides, the rational part of her insisted that she had nothing to fear. The man was just a figment of her overactive imagination. The ride was uneventful at first. No sign of him. She began to relax, even pulling out a book to pass the time. But as the train entered a dark tunnel, the lights flickered, and when they came back on, he was there. Standing at the far end of the car, his cap pulled low, his face a shadowed void. Clara froze. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge her, but she knew. He was waiting. Stop after stop, she stayed rooted to her seat, too afraid to move. And then her station came. The doors opened and she bolted out, weaving through the crowd. She didn't dare look back until she reached the street. This time he was closer. Standing at the mouth of the metro entrance, his head cocked to one side as though amused by her fear. Clara's days became a waking nightmare. No matter where she went, she saw him, in reflections, in the corner of her vision, always just far enough to leave her questioning her sanity. Her friends noticed her growing paranoia, the dark circles under her eyes, but she couldn't tell them. How could she explain the man who never moved yet was always there? One night, after another sleepless evening of pacing her apartment, Clara decided to confront him. She boarded the metro at the usual time, her heart pounding. Sure enough, he was there, standing in his usual spot. This time, she didn't look away. She walked toward him, her hands clenched into fists. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling but loud enough to turn heads. The man didn't respond. He tilted his head, his lips curling into a smile that seemed too wide, too sharp. The train lights flickered and went out. The car was plunged into darkness, and the air grew frigid. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as the faint glow of emergency lights illuminated the scene. He was gone. No one else on the train seemed to notice. They stared at their phones, their books, oblivious to the icy dread curling around her. The train pulled into the station, and Clara stumbled out, her legs weak. She never rode the metro again. But the man wasn't confined to the tunnels. Now she sees him everywhere. In her hallway mirror, in the shadows outside her window. And every time she locks eyes with him, his smile widens. She knows it's only a matter of time before he follows her somewhere she can't escape. The last train of the night was always eerily empty. Mara hated taking it, but her late shift at the diner left her no choice. She stepped into the dimly lit car, the doors hissing shut behind her. The air smelled faintly of damp metal, and the harsh fluorescent lights flickered sporadically. She scanned the space. Only one other passenger sat near the back, a man in a rumpled suit, his head bowed as if asleep. Choosing a seat as far from him as possible, Mara settled in and pulled her coat tight. The train jolted forward, rattling down the tracks. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, her own tired eyes staring back. Behind her, the man's reflection was oddly blurred, as though the glass couldn't quite capture him. Mara shifted uncomfortably and glanced back. He was still there, unmoving. The intercom crackled to life. "Next stop, Grove Street Station," it announced, though the voice sounded distorted, garbled. Mara frowned. Grove Street wasn't on her usual route. She glanced at the map above the door, but it had been vandalized, the name scratched out or smeared with grime. The train entered a tunnel and the windows went pitch black. Mara's stomach twisted as the car shuddered, the lights flickering more violently. For a moment, she thought she heard something, whispering, faint but persistent. She turned her head, scanning the car, but there was no one except the man in the suit. He wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing now, closer than before, his back to her. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard him move. His posture was strange, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. "Excuse me," she called, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond. The train jolted again, and the overhead lights went out completely, plunging the car into darkness. Mara gripped the edge of her seat, her pulse pounding in her ears. When the lights sputtered back to life, the man was gone. Mara shot to her feet, her eyes darting around the car. Empty. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. Did he get off at the last stop? But she hadn't heard the doors open, and there were no stops in the tunnel. The intercom crackled again, louder this time, the distorted voice returning. "You shouldn't be here." Her blood ran cold. The voice wasn't the conductor's. It sounded layered, like multiple voices speaking at once. The train began to pick up speed, the walls of the tunnel outside blurring into a single, dark smear. The car felt like it was tilting, as though the train were careening downhill. Mara clutched a pole to steady herself. "Hello?" she shouted. "Is anyone there? What's happening?" The lights went out again, but this time they didn't come back on. In the suffocating darkness, the whispering returned, louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from all around her, voices overlapping, growing louder until they were almost deafening. And then she felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, brushing against her shoulder. She screamed, scrambling backward, only to collide with something solid. Turning, she found herself face to face with the man in the suit. His eyes were gone. Black voids stared back at her, and his mouth hung open, a cavernous hole that seemed to stretch wider and wider. The whispers crescendoed into a scream, a single, piercing wail that drowned out everything else. The train lurched violently, and Mara was thrown to the floor. She scrambled to her feet just as the emergency lights flickered on. The car was empty again. But the train was no longer moving. It sat in a station Mara didn't recognize, the platform shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog. The sign above the platform read, "Terminus." Her legs trembled as she stepped off the train at the oppressive silence pressing in around her. The fog coiled around her ankles like living things, cold and damp. She looked for an exit but found none. Just endless dark corridors stretching into nothingness. A sound behind her made her freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing louder. She turned, her heart pounding, to see shadows emerging from the fog. Dozens of them. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, and their faces were wrong, distorted, as if their features had been smeared like wet paint. The man in the suit was at the center of them, his hollow eyes fixed on her. His mouth moved, though no sound came out, and then the others began to whisper. The words were incoherent but suffused with malice. Mara backed away, but the platform had no edge, just a vast abyss of darkness. The figures moved closer, their whispers swelling to a roar. She screamed as the fog swallowed her whole. The next morning, the train pulled into its usual station, empty except for a single item left behind, a diner uniform, neatly folded on an empty seat. No one could explain how it got there, or why the last train had arrived when it was never scheduled to run that night. To this day, some late-night commuters claim they've seen a woman's reflection in the windows of an empty car, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes wide with terror. But when they turn to look, the train is always empty. There's a station deep in the city's metro system that doesn't appear on any official map. It's called Platform 13T. The name circulates as an urban legend, whispered among commuters and late-night workers, but no one who claims to have seen it ever comes back with the same story. Lena had heard the tales before, but never gave them much thought. She was a practical woman, used to navigating the city's underbelly during her night shifts as a nurse. The metro was a means to an end, nothing more. That changed one stormy night when the power went out across the city. Lena had finished her shift late, and the rain had transformed the streets into a grid of shimmering black rivers. Her usual station was eerily quiet, the lights dimmer than usual, casting long shadows along the platform. The electronic schedule board was blank, and there were no announcements. Still, the rumble of an approaching train echoed down the tunnel. The train that arrived wasn't one she recognized. Its exterior was old, its metal tarnished and streaked with grime, the windows too dark to see through. But it stopped in front of her, the doors hissing open as if inviting her inside. She hesitated for a moment, but when the cold wind howled down the tunnel, she stepped aboard. The doors slid shut behind her, sealing her in. The car was empty, the seats covered in cracked leather, the lights flickering faintly. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been, with a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat. She chose a seat near the door, her fingers tightening around her bag. The train began to move, faster than she was used to, and the tunnels outside the window seemed impossibly long, as though they stretched far beyond the normal metro routes. The familiar stations didn't appear. No signs, no stops, only darkness rushing past the glass. Then the train slowed, the brakes screeched, the sound reverberating in the empty car. The lights overhead flickered and dimmed, and the train came to a halt. Lena squinted at the sign outside the window. It read, Platform 13. Her stomach tightened. She couldn't explain it, but something about the name struck her with an immediate and visceral unease. The platform outside was bathed in a pale, sickly light. The walls were cracked, streaked with what looked like rust, or perhaps something worse. She didn't want to get off, but the train doors slid open with a groan. A cold draft swept through the car, carrying with it a faint, acrid smell. Lena glanced at the empty platform. For a long moment, nothing happened. No one boarded. And then, in the distance, she saw a figure. It moved slowly, shuffling into the edge of the light. At first, she thought it was a man, hunched and wearing a tattered coat. But as it drew closer, she realized its movements were wrong, jerky, uneven, as though it were a puppet being dragged along by invisible strings. Lena's breath caught as the figure stopped at the edge of the train, its face obscured by shadow. The doors remained open, the cold air pressing in. "Don't get off," a voice rasped from behind her. Lena whipped around. The car was empty, completely empty, but she was sure she'd heard it, a hoarse, barely audible whisper. She turned back to the platform, but the figure was gone. The train doors closed with a sudden, jarring hiss. The lights in the car went out completely, plunging her into darkness. The train jolted forward, accelerating faster than seemed possible. She clutched the seat in front of her as the car swayed violently, the sound of the wheels grinding against the tracks deafening. Then came the whispers. They started softly, barely distinguishable from the noise of the train, but they grew louder, more insistent, until they were all around her. Hundreds of voices, murmuring in overlapping tongues, speaking words she couldn't understand. Her heart raced as she pressed her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. And then the lights flickered back on. The car was no longer empty. Figures filled the seats, each of them slumped forward, their faces hidden by shadows. They were dressed in outdated clothing, faded suits, old dresses, tattered scarves. The air grew heavier, colder, as the whispers became clearer. "You don't belong here," they said in unison, their voices hollow and echoing. Lena's eyes darted to the door. The train slowed again, screeching to a stop at another platform. This one was worse than the last, the walls covered in deep, claw-like gouges. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead. The figures in the seats began to move. Their heads lifted, and she saw their faces, or what was left of them. Hollow sockets where eyes should have been, mouths stretched into impossibly wide grins, their teeth yellow and sharp. The doors opened again, and this time they began to rise. Slowly. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, but they were coming for her. With a scream, Lena bolted down the car, slamming her fists against the emergency door at the end. It wouldn't open. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, as the figures closed in, their grins widening, and then the train plunged into darkness once more. When Lena woke, she was lying on a bench at her usual station. Morning light filtered through the cracked windows, and commuters bustled around her, oblivious. Her hands trembled as she sat up, her pulse still racing. Her bag was gone. So was her watch, her coat, everything she'd been carrying. The only thing left was a single crumpled ticket in her hand. It read, "One-way trip to platform 13. She never rode the metro again, but sometimes, late at night, she swore she could hear the faint, mournful sound of a train whistle in the distance, and she knew it was waiting for her. The passenger who never got off the metro line stretched beneath the city like veins, carrying thousands of commuters every day. Most were too absorbed in their phones or books to notice anything unusual. But seasoned riders knew the stories, whispers of a passenger who boarded the train late at night and never got off. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Malik, a night shift janitor, caught the last train home. The car was nearly empty, save for a young woman sitting several rows ahead. She was dressed in a business suit, her hair neatly tied back, and a small black briefcase rested on her lap. Malik didn't think much of her until the train pulled into the next station. No one boarded. The woman didn't move. As the train rumbled on, Malik's attention drifted back to her. Something about her seemed off. Her posture was too stiff, her head tilted slightly to the side as though listening to something only she could hear. The briefcase on her lap was tightly clutched, her knuckles pale against her dark suit. The train stopped at another station. Again, no one boarded, no one got off, but the woman remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed forward. Malik cleared his throat. "Long night, huh?" he called, trying to ease his unease. She didn't respond. The train jolted forward, and Malik felt the air grow colder. He pulled his jacket tighter, glancing up at the overhead lights as they flickered. When he looked back at the woman, she was staring at him. Her eyes were wrong. They were too wide, the whites gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. Her lips were parted just enough to reveal teeth clenched in an unnatural smile. Malik's breath caught in his throat. "Are you okay?" he stammered. The lights flickered again, and when they came back, she was closer. She hadn't moved, not that he'd seen, but now she was only a few rows away, her head tilted further, her smile wider. The briefcase was still on her lap, but her hands were no longer clutching it. They hung limply at her sides, the fingers too long, the joints bent at odd angles. Malik stood abruptly, backing toward the far end of the car. His pulse thundered in his ears. The intercom crackled to life. "Nah, next stop. End of the line," the conductor's voice said, though it sounded distorted, warped. Malik frowned. There was no end of the line on this route. The woman stood. Her movements were jerky, like a marionette on tangled strings. The briefcase slipped from her lap and fell to the floor with a metallic thud. Malik's eyes darted to it. It was smeared with something dark and wet. Blood. The train lights went out completely, plunging the car into darkness. Malik froze, his breath shallow. The air was ice cold now, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the car. When the lights flickered back on, the woman was directly in front of him. Her face was inches from his, her mouth stretched impossibly wide, her teeth sharp and glistening. Her eyes were black pits, endless voids that seemed to pull him in. Malik screamed and stumbled back, slamming into the emergency door. It wouldn't budge. "You shouldn't have looked at me," she whispered, her voice echoing inside his head. The train jolted again, and the lights went out for the final time. Malik felt her cold breath on his neck, her fingers brushing against his arm, and then everything went silent. The next morning, the metro ran as usual. A train operator found an abandoned briefcase on one of the cars, its surface slick with blood. Malik's jacket was draped neatly over the seat beside it, but he was nowhere to be found. Commuters still talk about the strange woman who sometimes appears on the late-night train. She sits silently, clutching her briefcase, her gaze fixed forward. And if you're unlucky enough to meet her eyes, you'll never reach your destination. They say she's still riding, waiting for her next passenger. The metro at night was different from the bustling chaos of the day. It was quieter, lonelier, with only the hum of the tracks and the faint crackle of the intercom breaking the silence. Marco worked as a security guard on the graveyard shift, patrolling the stations and ensuring no one lingered too long after the last trains departed. It was usually uneventful, but there was one station he dreaded: Claremont Junction. Claremont was an old station, barely used anymore. Its tiled walls were cracked and yellowed, the air always damp and musty. And then there were the stories. Other guards talked about hearing footsteps in empty tunnels, whispers coming from nowhere, and the faint sound of a train horn long after the lines were closed for the night. Marco had brushed it off as superstition, until the night he heard the train himself. It was 3:12 a.m. The last train had passed through hours ago, and the station was supposed to be empty. Marco was making his rounds when the faint rumble of a train echoed through the tunnels. He froze. The schedule was strict, and no trains were authorized at this hour. Curious and a little unnerved, he made his way to the platform. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the distinct screech of brakes. The station lights flickered as a train emerged from the tunnel. It wasn't like the sleek, modern trains he was used to. This one was older, ancient even, with a faded, soot-streaked exterior and cracked windows. The air grew colder as the train rolled to a stop. The doors slid open with a mechanical groan, but no one stepped out. Marco peered inside. The car was dimly lit, its seats worn and tattered. He was about to radio for assistance when a voice startled him. "All aboard," it said, deep and resonant, cutting through the stillness. Marco turned sharply to see a man standing on the platform. He wore an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, his cap tilted low over his face. The man's presence was unnerving, his posture too rigid, his smile too wide. "Sir, the trains aren't running," Marco said, his voice trembling slightly. The conductor tilted his head, his smile never faltering. "This one is," he said. "Last train of the night. You're coming aboard." Marco took a step back. "I'm not going anywhere, and you shouldn't be here either." The conductor's smile widened, impossibly so, splitting his face from ear to ear. His eyes gleamed with something that wasn't quite human. "All aboard," he repeated, his voice layered, echoing unnaturally through the empty station. Marco's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. Behind him, the train doors hissed shut, and the lights on the platform dimmed. The air grew heavier, the cold seeping into his bones. "Who are you?" Marco demanded, his voice shaky. The conductor stepped closer, and for the first time, Marco noticed something horribly wrong. His shadow didn't match his movements. It twisted and writhed, stretching unnaturally against the tiled walls. "You'll see soon enough," the conductor said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The train began to move, slowly at first, then faster, its wheels grinding against the tracks. Marco glanced at the retreating cars, and his heart stopped. Inside, staring back at him through the cracked windows, were dozens of faces. Pale, hollow-eyed, their mouths open in silent screams. They pressed against the glass, their hands clawing at the panes as the train disappeared into the tunnel. Marco stumbled backward, his breath ragged. The conductor was gone, as though he'd never been there. The station fell silent again, the oppressive stillness broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. Who would believe him? But every night after that, he avoided Claremont Junction. He couldn't shake the memory of those faces, their lifeless eyes locked onto his as the train vanished into the void. Months later, Marco overheard a commuter talking about a strange train. They said it picked up passengers late at night, people who were never seen again. He asked if they'd heard about the conductor. The commuter's face went pale. "You mean the one who smiles too much?" they whispered. "They say if you see him, it's already too late." That night, Marco handed in his resignation. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the city was quiet and still, he swore he could hear the faint screech of a train in the distance, and the echo of a voice calling out, "All aboard." The Metro's last train was always a ghost town, just the way Elise liked it. After long shifts at the hospital, the empty cars provided a rare moment of peace. Tonight was no different, or so she thought. She slid into her usual seat by the window and leaned her head against the cool glass. The car was nearly silent, save for the rhythmic clatter of wheels on the tracks. In the window's reflection, she could see the rows of empty seats behind her and the faint shimmer of the fluorescent lights overhead. But something caught her eye. A man was sitting at the far end of the car. Elise frowned. She could have sworn she was alone when she boarded. The man sat perfectly still, his face obscured by the shadows cast from the dim lights. He wore a dark coat and a hat pulled low, his posture rigid and unnatural. Elise turned her head to get a better look, but when she glanced down the aisle, the seat was empty. She blinked, her heart skipping a beat. Slowly, she turned back to the window. The man was still there, in the reflection. Her stomach tightened. She stared at the glass, unable to look away. The figure remained motionless, his face still hidden. Her breath fogged the window slightly as she exhaled, her pulse quickening. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice shaky and thin. No answer. The train rocked gently, the fluorescent lights flickering above her. The man in the reflection began to move. Elise's breath caught in her throat as he slowly rose to his feet. His head tilted at an odd angle, as though he were listening for something. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as he stepped closer. She whipped her head around, looking behind her. The car was empty. Her chest heaved as panic set in. She looked back at the window, and her blood ran cold. The man was standing right behind her reflection. She shot out of her seat, spinning around. Nothing. The aisle was empty, the rows of seats undisturbed. But when she turned back to the window, the man's reflection remained. He was closer now, his head tilted so low it seemed his neck might snap. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and dark, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. Elise stumbled backward, pressing herself against the opposite wall of the car. The train lurched, the lights flickering off entirely for a moment. When they came back on, the reflection was gone. But she wasn't alone. A deep, rasping breath sounded just behind her. Elise spun around, her scream echoing in the empty car. There was nothing there. The train screeched to a halt, throwing her off balance. The doors slid open to reveal a station she didn't recognize. The platform was eerily quiet, bathed in a sickly yellow light. The walls were covered in graffiti, but not the usual kind. These were intricate, almost ritualistic symbols that seemed to writhe and shift as she looked at them. Elise didn't move. She didn't dare step off the train. The doors began to close, but just before they sealed shut, something darted onto the platform. It was fast, a blur of shadow, and Elise only caught a glimpse as it disappeared into the station's darkness. The train jolted forward, plunging back into the tunnel. Elise collapsed into a seat, her hands trembling. She avoided looking at the windows, afraid of what she might see. The intercom crackled to life. Next stop, Terminus. Her stomach dropped. There was no stop called Terminus. The train didn't slow. It didn't stop. It just kept going, the tunnel growing darker and darker until the faint glow of the lights inside the car was the only thing left. And then, the reflections returned. Not just one. Dozens of them. Faces pressed against the glass, pale and hollow-eyed, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Elise clutched the edge of her seat, her nails digging into the fabric as the reflections began to move, clawing at the window, their faces distorting with each second. And among them was the man in the dark coat, his grin wider than before. The lights flickered one last time. When the train finally emerged from the tunnel the next morning, it was empty. Elise's belongings were found neatly folded on her seat, but there was no sign of her. Commuters whisper about the reflections now. Some say they see a pale face staring back at them from the glass, its hollow eyes locked onto theirs, even when they're alone. And if you ever hear the train announce a stop called Terminus, don't stay aboard. Late at night, the metro tunnels take on a life of their own. The hum of electricity feels alive, and the deep, resonant echoes of unseen trains make the darkness seem endless. Workers in the metro system speak in hushed tones about a certain stretch of track, a tunnel so deep beneath the city that the air itself feels heavy. They call it the Screaming Tunnel. Clara, a maintenance technician, didn't believe the stories. Ghost trains, phantom passengers, and eerie noises were just urban legends to her. She prided herself on being logical, grounded, and unshakable. So, when her supervisor sent her to inspect a power outage in that exact stretch of the metro, she rolled her eyes but grabbed her tools without hesitation. The first oddity appeared as she descended into the station. The escalators were off, forcing her to walk down into the yawning dark. The emergency lights barely flickered, casting long, erratic shadows. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. By the time she reached the platform, the only sound was her own breathing. Her flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing graffiti-covered walls and piles of debris left behind by vagrants. She called out, "Anyone here? Metro maintenance." But her voice echoed back at her, tinny and distorted. She stepped onto the tracks, carefully avoiding the electrified third rail, and began her inspection. Her boots crunched on gravel as she moved deeper into the tunnel. The light from the platform faded until she was enveloped in pitch black, save for the beam of her flashlight. The deeper she went, the colder it became. The air felt thick, damp, and almost alive. And then she heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper carried on a distant wind. It was indistinct at first, just a low hum that seemed to vibrate in her chest. But as she moved further, the whisper became clearer, words spoken too softly to understand. "Who's there?" Clara called, trying to keep her voice steady. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, and then the scream began. It wasn't a normal scream. It was layered. It was layered, impossibly loud, as if dozens, no, hundreds of voices were shrieking in unison. The sound came from deeper in the tunnel, an overwhelming wave of agony and despair that sent shivers down Clara's spine. Her flashlight flickered. "No, no, no," she muttered, smacking the side of the device. The beam returned, but it was weaker now, barely piercing the dark. She spun around, ready to retreat to the platform, but froze. The tunnel behind her wasn't empty anymore. Figures stood in the shadows, dozens of them. Their forms were indistinct, but their faces, their faces were unmistakable. Hollow eyes, mouths stretched wide in silent screams, their bodies flickering like bad television static. Clara stumbled backward, her heart pounding. "Stay away!" she shouted, swinging the flashlight like a weapon. The figures didn't move, they just stared. And then the ground began to shake. The distant rumble of an approaching train grew louder, accompanied by the flickering glow of headlights far down the tunnel. Relief flooded Clara's chest until she realized the train wasn't slowing. The light illuminated the figures, revealing their true forms. They were charred, their skin blackened and cracked as if they'd been burned alive. Their hollow eyes turned toward the approaching train, and for the first time, Clara understood the stories. This wasn't just a tunnel. It was a graveyard. The train barreled past her, a massive, rusted monstrosity that screeched and groaned as if in pain. The windows were shattered, revealing passengers slumped in their seats. Their faces were twisted in terror, their hands pressed against the glass in a futile attempt to escape. And then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had come. The figures began to move, slowly at first, then faster, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they closed in on her. The screaming returned, deafening and all-encompassing. Clara turned and ran, her flashlight swinging wildly, casting erratic beams of light on the walls. She reached the platform, gasping for breath, and scrambled up onto the concrete. But when she turned back, the tunnel was empty. The screaming was gone. The figures were gone. But Clara knew better. She quit her job the next morning, refusing to ever set foot in the metro again. They say the screaming tunnel takes those who don't listen to its warnings. If you hear the whispers, leave immediately. And if you hear the screams, it's already too late.